Okay, so now we've finished the chapters on contracts, and we're going to move to the second section of the course. That is corporate law, chapters 25 and 26. And for the next series of lectures, I'm going to talk about chapter 25, the nature of a corporation and its formation. I'm going to pretty well deal with most of this chapter. So I'm asking you to read just about all of it. And I pay particular attention to corporate capital on page 603, 604, 605, and 606. But generally, I cover most of the chapter, so that's different than some of the other chapters on contracts, where I only dealt with, small parts of some chapters or just half of some chapters. This chapter 25. I'm going to deal with most of the chapter, and those parts that I'm not going to deal with, I'll let you know. Okay, so where to start? Most of you are in business, and you'd understand that there's different ways of carrying on business. There's something called a sole proprietor, or a partnership, or a corporation. A sole proprietor is just simply the one human person operating a business. A partnership is two or more sole proprietors, if you like, or human beings carrying on a business together and sharing the money and so on and so forth. And then the corporate model is something totally different. In the situation, though, of a sole proprietor, although when you're doing his bookkeeping or her bookkeeping, you would show the assets of the business as separate from the owner, there is really no separation of the assets from the owner in law. For example, if someone is carrying on sole proprietorship and he owns a building, let's say it's a pizza store or something, he's the owner of it. And we just finished the section on contracts of enforcing judgments. If a sole proprietor defaults in a contract, probably would default in a loan contract and can't pay under the loan, the judgment creditor, as we saw before, can seize his house or his boat and motor or his cottage and garnish his wages and whatever. So that the sole proprietor has what we call unlimited liability to his or her creditors. The creditors can get after his assets and sell them to pay the debt. There's no difference with the partnership. Just because two people are carrying on business together in a partnership doesn't mean that they have any less liability to pay their debts to their creditors. So likewise, in a partnership, the creditors or partnership of the two partners, the creditors can get at their homes, their cars, and any assets they may own in their own name. But it's vastly different in a corporation, because in a corporation, we'll soon discover that is owned by people. They're called shareholders. They own shares in the corporation. But those shareholders are not the corporation. The corporation is a separate legal entity from the shareholders. So that when you have a corporation carrying on business, the contract is made between the corporation and, say, the bank that made the loan, or the business that's supplying them with, if it's a pizza business, the cheese or whatever. The contracts are made between the corporation and the suppliers, or the corporation and the bank and whatever. And if the corporation defaults on those contracts, that is, doesn't pay for the cheese or doesn't pay back its loan, the bank or the other creditors can't get the assets of the shareholders. So if the shareholders own homes or cars and boats and motors, they're owned by them individually. They're not owned by the corporation, because the corporation may own some assets. It may own a building. It may own a delivery truck. It may own whatever. And the creditors of the corporation can get at those assets and sell them to satisfy their debt, but they can't get at the assets of the shareholders. This is called the concept of the limited liability of the shareholder, so that the shareholder is his or her liability in being a shareholder of the corporation is limited to the amount that they've paid for their share. Because when they buy a share, we'll see later on in the chapter, they buy a share, if it's an initial share, they pay it into the corporation, and that becomes the corporation's money. And of course, the creditors of the corporation can get at that money, but it can't get any more money from the shareholders. So this is the big distinction, the radical distinction between corporations and sole proprietors, or corporations and partnerships. This is pointed out on page 589 under the nature of the corporation, and I'd ask you to read that the corporation is a legal person. It's a separate personality from the shareholders. It's another person altogether. Now, it's not a human person, but it is a legal person in the sense that it can own things. Even though it's not human like you and I, and we can't really see it. It exists, and it can own things, and it has to pay taxes, and it can sue, or it can be sued, and so on. This is all set out at the top of page 589. Then once you understand that the corporation is a legal person, just like you and I are, you can understand these distinctions between it and a partnership. Now, we're not taking up partnership in this course. I'm only dealing with corporations, but the corporation is distinguished from partnerships here on page 589 and 590 and so on. And I'd ask you to read through that. At the bottom of page 589 is the liability issue. This limited liability is why people incorporate, so that it protects them from the creditors. It's a good idea sometimes to incorporate your business so that your liability is limited to your creditors. Likewise, there's these other aspects of transfer of ownership, management, duty of good faith, and continuity that I'll deal with in the next segment of this lecture.